Katie Wilson, I give you credit because you are a young spunky gal who's taking on the system in that big Bruce Harrell. You actually, last time I checked, and you might back me up, you're ahead in the polls.
Yeah, well, that's what it looks like. The one public poll has me 3 points ahead. Now, that was a couple months ago. Take it with a grain of salt, but we're coming up on the August 5th primary here, so we'll know soon enough where things stand.
Why do you think that is, Katie Wilson? Why are you ahead in the polls?
You know, I think that we're in a moment here in Seattle and to some extent around the country where people are struggling, right? Housing is unaffordable. If you're a renter, the rents have been going up and up and up. If you're a homeowner, you might feel rising property taxes, right? People are struggling. I have a toddler.
Yeah.
You're paying $2,000 a month for 4 days a week of childcare. You know, it's wild out there.
Yeah.
And, you know, groceries are expensive. Everything's expensive. We have an escalating homelessness crisis. I think people are struggling, and they don't see the action that they want to see from City Hall right now.
So if the person is struggling financially, then the government is going to come in and make things less expensive?
You know, the government has a range of policy tools that affect how affordable housing is and how much housing we have. So right now we have a lot of rules around where housing can be built, how much housing can be built. You know, large swaths of the city, you cannot build apartment buildings, and that's really restricted supply. So over the last 20 years, we've seen the population explode with the rise of the tech industry, and our housing stock has not grown to match. So one of the things that I want to do as mayor is make it easier to build housing, especially family-sized housing, in more of the cities so that we actually have housing for all the folks who are going to continue to move here. Now, there's other things the government can do, too. One of the reasons I jumped into this race was that we had a special election back in February on a funding measure for Seattle's new social housing developer.
Yeah.
And Seattle voters have now told us twice, overwhelmingly, in a landslide, that they want to see the city develop permanently affordable, publicly owned, mixed income housing. And our current mayor was the face of the opposition to that campaign. And that's one of the things that made me jump in, because I really believe that this is not the answer to our housing crisis, but it is an important part of the answer. And we need city leadership that's going to respect the will of the voters and that's going to fight to make it work.
I think you've said that before.
I have said that before.
Okay. So it's basically supply and demand. And you recognize, and I do as well, and others have seen that almost, I forget the percentage of property in Seattle, it's zoned out, you can't put anything on it, right? Because then you run into the problem where here's this person who's got the little bungalow over there in Greenwood, and then, I don't want a duplex next to me. Everybody goes all upset. They're all in favor of affordable housing, but not in my neighborhood, right?
Yeah.
So then you have to get in there and change the zoning and allow, which they have started to do, which is pretty good. When it comes to parking, you don't have to have that sort of thing. Auxiliary dwelling units are going to be, more affordable, or at least be able to permit into areas. So you're right. So you have to be able to increase the supply to bring down the cost. The thing that I find, because I watched all the videos and stuff that you put up there, and I want to ask you about this, that the government right now, so is what, $8 billion, $8.4, $5 billion, something that the government is spending in Seattle. And I looked at it and I thought, well, that's a lot of money. And where are they going to get the money from? But they've noticed they're getting less money because the golden goose has flown over to Bellevue, right? Because if you start to raise the price of something, people will try to find it cheaper somewhere else. And in this case, they go to Bellevue or they go to Redmond, as Microsoft has gone there. Are you concerned that if you continue to tax these corporations, that they will eventually pick up and leave and you'll be left with an empty building and them just having a new zip code?
Yeah, so this is an important question, and it's important to talk about it rationally and not kind of blow it out of proportion.
Yeah.
So back in 2020, the city passed a tax called the Jumpstart Payroll Expense Tax, and I was actually on the inside, helping to design and pass that tax. It is a tax on wealthy corporations based on the amount that they of their payroll to high-paid employees. So it really does focus on the tech industry. And honestly, it's been a very robust and successful tax in the sense that it prevented devastating service cuts during the pandemic, and it has allowed our current mayor to balance the budget every single year he's been in office. It brings in somewhere around $400 million a year. And, these are corporations. I mean, Washington, for all of the complaints from corporations about our taxes, Washington's a very low tax state compared to a lot of other states, and has a great business climate, right? And tech companies locate here for all kinds of reasons that have nothing to do with taxes, right? They do it because the talent is here. They do it because the workers want to, move here. And there are some indications that Amazon may be shifting some high-paid positions to technically be located in Bellevue to escape this tax.
Yeah.
But we have not seen evidence that that is happening at any scale.
Well, they are getting less revenue.
But that's more, there's bigger forces at work there, right? There's a general kind of, you've seen tech companies starting to lay off some workers. And part of it, too, is that, the tax is based on total compensation, including stock options. And so it kind of goes up and down with the stock market. So the fact that the projections are, it's raising way more than was initially projected when it was passed. So some of this, when they talk about lower projections, it's it looks like it's going to bring in less than we thought, according to last year's projection, but it's actually way more than we initially thought. So it's still a very robust funding source, and I think has been very successful. But I do think that as we move forward, we just do need to be cognizant and pay attention to the data and what we're actually seeing in terms of possible job shifting. We don't want that to happen at a large scale, but we can't we can't say we're not going to do a tax because there may be some movement, right? You think of transit fares, right?
Sure.
The transit agency will raise transit fares, even though it's known that that will decrease ridership, right? Of course, people respond to incentives. We just have to pay attention to the scale of that.
Well, in Seattle, they don't pay the fare.
I pay the fare. Lots of people pay the fare.
I know you do. I know you do. But the recovery box is pretty slim.
That's
it used to be
true.
at 30 or 40%. I think it's at 8 or 10, wherever it is. When you say corporations will pay the taxes, who pays the tax?
With the Jumpstart tax, Amazon pays a very large chunk of it.
I know, but where does
it
come from?
What do you mean?
Well, who pays the tax? So you say the corporation pays the tax.
Yeah.
Corporation, what do you mean a corporation pays the tax? Where's the money come from?
Amazon and other tech companies.
I know, but where? Amazon's going to pay it, but Amazon doesn't pay it. It comes from somewhere. Where? Who will pay it?
What kind of answer are you looking for?
Well, the answer is the corporation. Here's who pays the tax on a corporate tax. Either the shareholder does, because they don't have as much money, so the shareholder does not make as much, or the customer pays it.
Sure, right? Yeah. No, there's different ways that a tax on corporations
or the employee
filters
pays
down.
it. Right.
For sure.
So when you say the corporation's going to pay the tax, well, the corporation's not a person; it's a collection of people. But ultimately, there's not Mr. Amazon. So either the employee will not get as much money, or the shareholder will not, or the customer will end up paying for the things, because it always goes down.
And in this case, I think that for the most part, what we're probably seeing, yes, okay, all of those things, but and I think that is a fine trade-off, right? We're talking about, if you're thinking of the shareholders of Amazon and if you're thinking about the employees, and again, we're talking about very highly paid employees, that is a progressive tax to the extent that the tax is actually being passed along or coming from those. Do you ever
anybody would say, I have an idea. Why don't you cut spending? 60% of the people who work in this government in Seattle make more than $100,000. It's I got an idea. Reduce, right? Rather than continuing to try to get more taxes, because eventually, you'll see Amazon and Microsoft and Expedia, they'll pick up and move somewhere else because it's cheaper. I was even reading how Bellevue's more expensive than Redmond, so Microsoft let's move to Redmond. So everybody, you'll go and try to find the cheapest thing, whatever you need to buy. The same thing happens here. So people would say, hey, if Katie Wilson got in there and said, we're gonna look to make cuts, I think that would get you some people to go, yeah, good, let's make some cuts, as opposed to always looking for more revenue.
Well, here's the thing. You're talking about cutting the salaries of city employees.
I'm just using that as an example, right? But not just cutting their things, but just looking at the programs and saying maybe these are not effective.
Here's a few points to make. One point to make is that our current mayor and council, and especially council, who are much to the right of me, maybe you would agree with them more than you agree with me.
I don't agree with them, but anyway, go ahead.
Okay, I'm curious to hear about that. But they came into office promising to do exactly what you're talking about.
Yes, they did.
They came in promising to audit the city budget, to look for places to cut, and you know what? They added a lot of spending. The current mayor and council have added a lot of spending.
Right.
And so, you can interpret that the way you wish, but one way to interpret it is that it's harder than you think. And that when you actually look at the programs that the city's funding, they're things that people need. And so if you're talking about cutting, you're going to end up cutting things that people need. We have a budget for filling potholes. You want to cut that? We have a budget for, trying to get people into shelter. You want to cut that, right? So when it comes down to it's easy to kind of wave your hands and say, let's cut and find efficiencies. And I absolutely think that we need to spend our resources as efficiently and effectively as
Right.
possible. But, easier said than done. I will say that in terms of employee pay, the government competes with the private sector for talent. And so in a city like Seattle, where we have lots of high-paid industries, tech industry, et cetera, the city government is competing with those industries for talent. So if you were to just bump down pay on all those city jobs, those positions would be vacant. And that's actually already a problem, right? We have vacant positions because people don't want those jobs because they can make more in the private sector. So, there's not an easy solution to this, but I'm just pointing out that it's not necessarily easy to just say, like, we're going to pay people less. All these people are overpaid. And also, you mentioned $100,000.
Yeah.
Have you seen housing costs in Seattle? Have you seen rent in Seattle? Like, that's actually not a very high income here in Seattle.
Why do you think rent is so high? Because we talked about supply.
Yeah.
Supply
I
is
want to go
limited.
back to.
Okay.
I want to finish answering your question about cuts. So,
sure.
yeah, and I mean, I think I do think that we can spend money better and more effectively in a lot of areas of the city budget, and I think homelessness is an example of that, right? Where we are spending a lot of money, but we end up spending it inefficiently because our systems aren't coordinated. And in the case of the current mayor, what we've seen is. We've actually lost shelter capacity every single year he's been in office, and we have far more people sleeping on the streets than ever before. And so when the city's then funding services, whether that's drug treatment or case management or mental health services, but we don't actually have the shelter or housing, stable places for people to go to, that money ends up being spent inefficiently because, kicking a drug habit is hard.
Yeah.
Try doing it while living in a tent.
Yeah.
Right. And so I do think that there's a lot more that we can do to make sure that we're using the resources that we have efficiently. So that's not cutting spending overall necessarily for homelessness, but that is changing the way we're spending that money so that we're getting better results.
Do you think, speaking of homeless, so I think it was, what was the year they decided it was going to be an emergency? And this has been going on. And every single year.
10 years ago.
10 years ago, we declared an emergency,
a civil state of emergency on homelessness.
I think the emergency is the amount of money that they've spent on this stuff, right? What percentage of people do you think are coming from some other place other than Seattle or King County that we are now providing services for?
A very large majority of the folks who are homeless on our streets became homeless in King County. And that's something that we know from our point-in-time count and surveys that are done, right? I mean, yes, sure, you can find people here or there who are coming from out of state or something, but the vast majority, were housed in King County or certainly in Washington before becoming homeless. Now, it is true that the homelessness often gets concentrated in Seattle. People who become homeless in South King County or North King County will come to Seattle because, yes, that is where the services are, and other cities around the county often have not done as much to have permanent supportive housing or shelter or services for folks. So they do tend to gravitate to Seattle. But yeah, no, we're not seeing a big influx from the rest of the country. I think that's just a falsehood.
Okay, well, I could show you numbers, but I'm not going to argue with that. But you would agree with if you subsidize something, you get more of it. If you tax it, you get less of it.
I think that's a little simplistic. I mean,
It is. I am simplistic.
Okay.
But I do believe that if you provide lots of services for people, it will be motivating for somebody to do something like go get those services. Here's my idea. You ready? That you go to everybody that's already here and you say, okay, we're going to get a count on all of you. I think they tried to do this in Washington, D.C. because they got upset because people were coming in from Maryland and coming in from Virginia. And the people there in D.C. were like, well, we don't want to provide services for people that are just crossing over the state line and coming in here. So what they tried to do is set up a program where they say, okay, right now, everybody here, we give you a card, we give you some way to identify you. So this is it. You're in, we're done. If you're coming in from Burien, we're not going to provide services for you. If you're coming in from Bellevue, coming here, we're not going to give it. So we're going to have a set number of people that we will provide the services for. If not, I do believe we incentivize people to make a change and come to Seattle because here's where the services are. But the numbers keep growing every single year. So in some way to say, okay, right now, this is everybody we're going to serve. Fixed number. This is it. If you're coming in trying to get some services and stuff, you're not in at this point. You have to go back to where you were. And those people, that city, that government, that revenue will have to provide the services for you. Because if not, we'll just keep attracting more and more people to come here to Seattle. And that's, I think, unfair to the structure. I think it's unfair to the people that are already homeless in Seattle because there's less for them. And you just continue to have these numbers go up and up. What is it? Doubled was the number of homeless? The count is how much were you? 24,000 or something like that?
It's very high.
It's very high, right.
Yeah.
So that would be one idea. You probably don't seem very excited by that idea, but that's okay.
No, I'm not excited by that idea. I mean, I think it is premised on what you said, that like people are just coming in from all kinds of other places, and I don't think that's.
Well, how do we generate? Where do all these homeless people come from?
Because housing costs are so high. If you look around the country, like you look at the data, you look at different cities with different housing costs, homelessness is very, very directly correlated with rents. And so every like $100 increase in rents, you're going to see like a 5% increase in homelessness. I don't know if those are the exact numbers, but it's something like that, right? Mm-hmm. And there's a great book about this called "Homelessness is a Housing Problem." Mm-hmm. It came out of at least one of the co-authors is at the University of Washington. And that's not to say that obviously drugs, mental illness, there's lots of things
break
going on
down in the
here,
family and relationship.
But it's a very data-centered book, which really shows how housing affordability is at the core of the homelessness crisis. And so where people are coming from is they're losing their housing, right? Their landlord is coming and saying, you want to renew your lease? Well, that's going to be $500 a month. And they're looking at it and they're saying, I can't afford that. And they're looking around at the housing market and they're saying, there's nowhere I can go. And so then they're on a friend's couch for a while. And then, the friend is like, you can't stay here anymore. And then they're in shelter and then they're on the street, right? So that is what's happening. So earlier in our conversation, I mentioned that vote on social housing earlier this year in February, special election. And, he was the face of the opposition. His face was plastered all over the mailers. And Seattle voters just said no. They said, we have an affordability crisis. We want to do something about it. And we don't care what the mayor says. And that just taught me how out of touch he is with the struggles that ordinary people are facing. Mm-hmm. He doesn't feel the cost of living crisis. And so that really showed me that there was an opening there. I think he's out of touch with what people are experiencing on the ground these days.
So for those that missed it in the very beginning, Katie did mention that we have to build more. We got to build more because we've raised supply, right? Demand, supply meet, the price comes down. But if we don't have as many apartments and places for people, so Washington just passed. I think we're the third state now for rent cap. It's also known as rent control, which they will only be able to raise the rent a certain portion. History has shown, especially in Portland and now in parts of Minnesota, they have realized, if we make it less attractive for corporations to build, right, 60% decrease in building permits in Portland, that because if you cap what the person can make on building the building, they won't build the buildings there. So then we won't get the supply that we needed. So you sort of see where if you're saying to the corporation that's going to build an apartment building, well, you can only make this amount of money. They'll just take their money somewhere else and build somewhere they can actually create more supply. Are you concerned that this rent cap or rent control will have that effect upon the building in Seattle?
No, not at all. And there's a few reasons why. First of all, I think you have to understand that rent control or rent stabilization is not one thing, right? There's a number of ways that you can do rent regulation. And this law is very, very weak. So it basically limits landlords to an annual rent increase of 7% plus the rate of inflation up to a maximum of 10%. Mm-hmm. So, if you're renting an apartment for $2,000 a month, a 10% increase, and that's about what the cap is this year, is $200 a month. That is a large rent increase. So it's really not demanding very much of landlords. The other thing to your argument is that there's actually exemptions for new development. And I don't remember exactly the length of time, but it's like the first 12 years or something like that. Mm-hmm. So this is not something that even kicks in for new builders. And so it's really a very mild regulation. This is not something that's going to affect building.
What is the average rent increase a year? Do you know in Washington?
I mean, it has changed. I mean, it changes every year, right? But coming out of the pandemic, we were seeing very large rent increases. There was a couple years there, I think like 2021, 2022, where averages must have been over 10%. I mean, like 12% or something like that, at least in the King County area. And that's an average, right? So that's not reflecting everyone's individual experience. And, I've done a lot of work over the years fighting for affordable housing, fighting for stronger protections for renters. And so I've done a lot of talking to renters, knocking on doors. And I've met so many people who would come home to a notice from their landlord that their rent was going up 30%, right? Mm-hmm. That's basically an eviction notice.
Yeah, because people all of a sudden can't absorb that. I would take out that COVID numbers, pre-COVID and rest, because when you had the moratorium in place, it really threw everything entirely off. During the commercial break, Joe had mentioned that you had been referred to as Was it Mamdani?
West Coast Mamdani?
Yeah, right? That's the guy who people say is either Marxist or communist in New York, and he wants to be able to...
He's a democratic socialist.
Okay.
And, very probably the next mayor of New York City.
Yes, he probably is. So this gets into the question of, because I hear him use the term, and you've used it as well, fair share. The people should pay their fair share, right?
I don't think I've used that term.
You've never used fair share?
I mean, I'm not saying I've never used it, but it's not something I haven't used it in our conversation.
Okay, but I know, but just generally you talk to somebody who's a democratic socialist or somebody that believes in a bigger government, they'll talk about, well, people need to pay their fair share. I think Bruce Harrell has said that. It's kind of a common term that people
Sure.
use.
I mean, the context in which I would definitely use that is our tax system, right? And here in Washington State, we have now the second most regressive tax system in the country. And what that means is that if you look at how much people are paying in state and local taxes compared to their income, the lowest income people, working people, middle income people, they're paying way more of their income in state and local taxes than the very rich. So that's kind of the definition of a regressive tax system. And I think it would be fair to say that in that case, the wealthy are not paying their fair share.
Right. Well, but they pay their fair share when it comes to federal taxes. But you're right. It is unfair in the state of Washington that most of the taxes are collected through sales tax, right?
Yeah.
And if the person is only making $30,000 a year and they're paying a certain percentage, 10% of their sales tax, that takes a big bite out of the money they make.
Definitely.
Yeah. I'll give you Thomas Sowell's great line. It says, what is your fair share of someone else? What is your fair share of what someone else has worked for? And that's the question I always had for people. I always say about fair share. The corporations should pay their fair share, or the rich should pay their fair share. I am concerned that the rent cap, if I were a landlord and I'm now told, and if my average rent increases 3%, if I'm now told I can go 7 plus 3 on inflation, I will go 7 or 3 plus 3. I might go to 8%. Why wouldn't I if I've been told that I can do that sort of thing? And if I was previously renting at 3% or 4%, if I notice the others are going up, I'll go up as well, right? And then you run into the
right
problem.
now you can go up to 20, 30, and 40%, and some landlords are. So that's the kind of behavior it's designed to prevent.
Right, but when the landlord does that, they lose that tenant.
Right, but I mean, I think they do that because they think they can then get a higher paying tenant in.
That possibly, or also their costs have gone up. Their costs have gone up for insurance. Their cost goes up for taxes. Their cost goes up because of maintenance, supplies. All this stuff is driving up the cost for the landlord. The average landlord, what's the total amount? What do you think the net amount of money the landlord makes a year? We're not talking about the big, not like Greystone, not those guys, just like the mom and pop.
I mean, that depends totally on how many units someone owns, where they are. I mean, you want me to pull a number out of my ass or what?
No, you don't have to. No, just generally because some people, the landlord is the guy with the snidely whiplash mustache and he's tying up the woman and putting her on the train tracks. You must pay the rent. I can't pay the rent, right? The idea of there's all this money that they're making. They also know, the landlord knows, I don't want to raise the rent too high because I don't want my person to leave because the cost of having to put somebody else in there, there's additional cost there. Sure. I do think that sometimes they'll raise the rent to get people out of there, right? But overall, it's a marketplace as well. And if the state comes in and says, well, you can't raise over this amount of money, you're capping what can be made. And then you continue to add additional expenses to that landlord, right? That's
the fact
other
is
problem.
that what's happening right now with these large rent increases is that people are falling into homelessness, and then that becomes an expense for everyone and a problem for everyone, right? It's contributing to this larger public health, public safety crisis that affects everyone, landlords and everyone else, and especially, obviously, the people who are actually homeless and suffering on the streets. So it's creating a larger social problem, and the idea of this very mild regulation is to try to mitigate those damages.
I see. You think there's a connection between homelessness and public safety as well?
Absolutely. I mean, I think what we've seen with our current mayor, just to bring the topic back to the race that I'm running.
Sure. Because they're going to get it down to the two of you. They're going to compare and contrast and what he has and what you have.
Absolutely. And so I think we've seen a real failure to meaningfully address the homelessness crisis. And we talked about this before. We have far more people living on the streets than ever before, and the administration's approach has really focused on encampment removals. So instead of getting people inside, they're just moving people from place to place. And, this is responding to complaints from residents, from businesses about tents. And they'll brag that there are way fewer tents now than there were 4 years ago, but there are more people. And so what you're doing when you're doing this is you are destabilizing people. So now instead of sleeping in a tent, you have someone maybe sleeping in the doorway of a small business. Mm-hmm. And they're, maybe they have mental health issues, maybe they're on drugs, and now they're really stressed out because they have no stability. And so maybe they break the windows, maybe they behave aggressively toward customers. And so you're actually making our public safety problems worse by not meaningfully addressing homelessness.
Okay, the final, you read, oh, darn it. Andrew, I got to go to traffic. Will you come back again?
Yeah, we got one question for.
Go ahead. We want to do it. You want to do it at the top?
Let's do it. Yeah, if you can wait.
Can you hang on?
Okay, well, hang on.
Short segment.
It's going to be short. It's quick.
It better be a good
for
question.
you. All right.
Okay.
It better be a good question. Oh, my God. Wow, that's tough. Hit her with a question, Joe. Right. This is from a listener. Here we go.
Time for one question. This is Alexia in Seattle, and she says, can you please ask Katie for her plan for Aurora Avenue North? As someone who lives there, it trumps all other issues for my neighbors and I. The area has never fully recovered since the pandemic.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I will try to give it a satisfying answer in just a few minutes here. So, and Aurora Avenue North is definitely a hot spot right now in Seattle. We have others, right? Obviously, downtown is still troubled. Little Saigon is another really big one. And, the answer in these cases is multifaceted. It's going to require the right combination of police response and civilian response and the right coordination. We've seen a couple of problems with the current administration's approach. There was an audit recently that showed that the city's approach to gun violence is really disjointed. So we need to make some really thorough improvements there to how the city is addressing both gun violence prevention and responding to and analyzing gun violence so that we can improve that situation. I know that's one of the issues going on up in Aurora. Mm-hmm. In terms of prostitution, our current mayor and council passed these soap and soda laws, right? Stay out of prostitution or drug area, stay out of area of prostitution. Not everyone's going to like my answer on this, but those laws they're very performative in my opinion, right? It's tempting to say like we're cracking down, we're doing something. Those laws have not meaningfully been enforced yet, and that's really because they're not very useful, right? The data on how these laws work in practice shows that people still go into the zones that they've been banished from for all kinds of reasons. And it really, at best, it's kind of moving disorder to adjacent neighborhoods. So I don't think that that's going to be our most effective approach. We really need to engage proactively with individuals who are causing problems. And again, this is going to be a mixture of police and civilian response. And we have successful diversion programs like the Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion LEAD program that need to be scaled up and moved to more neighborhoods. And so this is where, you have someone who's engaging in illegal activity. Instead of booking them into jail, and, I think that jail can sometimes interrupt harmful patterns of behavior, but it's not a good default response because what usually happens is people cycle right back out into the street and the same things happen, right? So you have a diversion program where we're tracking someone into shelter or housing with services, and there's accountability there, and we're basically trying to get people into a better situation. And so that's a much more intensive approach than just being reactive when problems occur, but that's the only way that we're going to improve conditions. So I think the city needs to put a lot more kind of problem-solving thinking into how to improve conditions on Aurora. There's also bigger infrastructural answers where we need to revitalize those neighborhoods, right? We need to encourage utilization of empty commercial space, new businesses. We need to make it more safer and more walkable to make that into a place where there's just more activity 24/7, because we know that the more eyes there are on the street, the more kind of positive activity there is. That also helps with the crime and the disorder.
Will the government get bigger or smaller if you're elected?
I think the honest answer to that is I don't know, because some of it depends on what happens to the economy and to, cuts that Trump might be making that affect Seattle. So, even if I want to make it bigger, it might get smaller.
All right. There we go. Good answer. All right. Katie Wilson, thank you for your time and your candor as well. Thanks for coming on, because probably most people, if you checked it out, like, I don't want to go on that guy. That guy's a jerky conservative. But do we treat you fairly?
Oh, yeah. It's great to be here.